Good afternoon, my friends. This is the Grim Flayer, and I hope you're doing very well today. Welcome to a super hype MH2 spoiler video. This one is centered around Tourach Dread Cantor, which is a card that I've thought for a little while now we would be seeing in Modern. We got teased with some hints and some puzzles to solve by Maro in the weeks leading up to the spoiler season. And one of the leaks basically said there's an iconic card, that would be him to Tourach, that has been banned before, whose namesake will be getting a legendary creature card. It doesn't already have a creature card to begin with in any way, shape, or form, something like that. And I, of course, have had him to Tourach on the brain, wondering, will we possibly get this card in MH2? So Tourach is one of the first legends, as far as potential for that puzzle goes, that I thought of. Turns out we're getting him. Here he is. But the people in the Discord, the ungrateful denizens of my Discord, they're just kind of dunking on Tourach, right? They're saying, oh, he's LARPing, he's a wrestler wannabe, he's just getting ready for White Boy Summer, he's doing body positivity, he's an e-boy, all of this type of stuff. There is no respect for our dread Cantor. Now maybe they don't know what the word Cantor means. Cantor, noun. An official who sings liturgical music and leads prayer in a synagogue, or a person who sings solo verses or passages to which the choir or congregation responds. So you're supposed to respond with kind of gratitude and awe, not with all this dunking on Tourach. I won't have it. So we have Tourach Dread Cantor in a couple of different variants. We have the original art. We have the original art with the old border retro treatment, and we have a different one whose art people were also kind of mocking in the extended art version. Personally, I think it's pretty cool, but at the same time, I am laughing, along with the rest of them, at some of the very funny descriptors. But enough with that. Enough with the memeing. What does this card do? Will it rock? Let's get into it. Thank you very much for watching. Tourach Dread Cantor is a 2-drop, 1 gray and 1 black, for a legendary human cleric, power 2, toughness 1. It's got a kicker cost of BB, right? So you can either cast it for 1B or cast it for 1 BBB. So he's a 2-1, he's got protection from white. He's also got, whenever an opponent discards a card, put a +1/+1 counter on Tourach Dread Cantor. When Tourach enters the battlefield, if it was kicked, target opponent discards 2 cards at random. So basically, if you kick it, you're casting him to Tourach in terms of an ETB effect. Now, granted, him is much, much, much better on 2 than it is on 4. If you had to hard cast him for 4 and there was no option to deploy him for 2 and then increase his efficacy with the kicker cost, I think we wouldn't probably be even talking about it, right? That is just a little bit too slow. Now, granted, in the right matchups, it is still a 3-for-1. So maybe in a really grindy meta, or maybe as a sideboard card, maybe you could talk about it. But the fact that you can deploy him as a 2-1 on curve, just to get a body down, to start pressuring the opponent, to start pressuring the opponent's planeswalkers, to help go wide, and indeed to grow, even though he doesn't grow himself with the kicker cost in the event that you hardcast him for 2, this makes the card modal. This makes the card flexible, and this makes the card very, very interesting. So we're going to talk a little bit about what this printing means in terms of what other cards we may or may not see. We're going to talk about the various use cases for Tourach, and we're going to talk about the best black-based mid-range shells for it, and then maybe ones that he's not so hot in. So obviously the printing of Tourach means that we're not going to see him to Tourach. Fun though it would be to curve Inquisition into him, into Liliana, into Tourach himself. Overkill, yes. Very fun, yes. We're not going to see him to Tourach. I think the odds of that were very low to begin with. A card that I've actually been pretty bullish on is actually Gerard's Verdict. And between Grief and between Tourach Dread Cantor, I'm actually less convinced than I have been in a while that we might see Gerard's Verdict. I thought this card was actually relatively likely for a couple different reasons that I talked about during my speculation videos a couple months ago. But how many, pretty strong X for 1 potential discard effects can they truly print? Now, granted, it's never going to be too many for me, personally, but I think that with Grief, with Tourach, I'm not sure we're going to see Gerard's Verdict anymore. Okay, so back to Tourach himself, you basically have a few different ways to use him. Number one, you use him as a simple 2-1, and the 2-1 has protection from white. Now, protection from white is actually part of what I think does make this card rock, at least to the point where he's playable in some metagames, because in our side of the color pie, in the BGX mid-range kind of sphere, we don't have many protection effects, right? We don't have protection from white, and if you think about what protection from white actually means against certain decks that are, of course, mono-white, or maybe blue-white control, or green-white decks such as Heliod, all of their answer cards, or almost all of them in terms of dealing with resolve permanents, are white. So the upside here is pretty huge in multiple different ways. Number one, if you need an early pro-white play, you can just make it. If you have enough of a shell as far as your progression goes around that, you're not sure if you're going to get to 4 mana, you're not sure if the depletion will be all that relevant if and when you do. Well, if the pro-white is relevant, then so is Tourach. Let me remind you that turn 3 Liliana is still one of the best and most popular plays BGX mid-range can make, and you don't have to grow Tourach off of his own ETB with the kicker alone. If you're following up with Liliana +1s, or indeed just regular old discard spells, Tourach will grow from that as well. So that's very, very nice. And the other mode that you can use Tourach in is, of course, as a 3-for-1. You are going to ETB, the opponent discards 2, and you get a creature behind. And if the opponent has 2 cards to discard, Tourach will be not only just a body, a respectable body, a 4-3 that can scale even more should more discard effects be in your future. So it's not like he's a Tarmogoyf, right? I don't want to oversell his scaling. His scaling is definitely a little modest relative to some of the big, beefy beaters that we are used to seeing at this 2-drop slot in BGX, the size of Goyf, how hard Skoos can scale, all of the rest, right? But Tourach Dread Cantor, very, very flexible, and indeed that ETB is completely insane. So right now, as things stand, I'm seeing him as best against control, best against maybe a stumbling big mana opponent if you've managed to blow up a land, set them back a little bit somehow. He can be a really good turn 4 haymaker if they're struggling to get cards out of their hand, and of course good in mid-range mirrors, especially if the opponent is kind of refueling somehow, whether it be with Seasoned Pyromancer, with Lurrus of the Dream Den brought in as a companion, something like that. So Tourach with lots and lots to like, but what shell does he go best in? The first shell to think about is maybe Jund. And I think it's not unreasonable to try him in Jund, but I suspect that he will not shine there quite as much as he will in other shells. Why? Well, there's a few reasons. Here are a couple. Number one, Jund's land base is painful, so remember that Tourach needs triple black by turn 4 in order to be kicked, and not that Jund can't do that. It's just a little bit harder maybe for Jund to accommodate that, especially if we're factoring life totals into the equation. Now, maybe in the matchups where the him effect on T4 is really live, your life total is not as much of an issue. I understand that, but it's still not free. Another thing to consider is Kroxa, and there is some temptation to say that, yes, Kroxa and Tourach actually work well together because you deplete them all the way, basically, and then Kroxa can trigger and it'll be great. That's definitely nice. Like, if the opponent has enough cards in their hand where your depletion comes in the right order and everything goes to plan, sure, you'll deplete them exactly as Richard Garfield would have intended, right? But the problem is you are basically becoming a little bit like an 8-rack deck without some of the payoffs and without maybe the consistency or the linearity of 8-rack, for better or for worse. In other words, said more simply, there is such a thing as too many discard effects. There is such a thing as too much depletion, and maybe Jund already has enough depletion because it's playing Kroxa, right? You've got your traditional 6 discard spells for Liliana plus maybe 2 Kroxa. Is there as much room for Tourach? I would say not. And is there as much need need for Tourach? I would say not, compared to redless mid-range decks who cannot play Kroxa. And while we're talking about red, let's talk maybe about Rakdos. They're also a Kroxa deck, so the same thing kind of applies. Maybe Tourach's a little bit better there. Maybe it's a little bit easier to make triple black, at least if you're not on Blood Moon, right? So that's another potential non-bow. The other thing about Rakdos that could be a little bit appealing is we're playing cards like Magmatic Channeler to filter. So if Tourach is maybe exactly what you need, you can dig for it. If he's maybe not so much what you need, you can filter it away. That's definitely a consideration. Nevertheless, we don't want to say, well, if this card's not optimal, at least we can filter it away. That's not really a good deck building heuristic. So my conclusion here is that Tourach a little bit worse in these red-based mid-range decks. They just want to go a little bit faster. They already have Kroxa for like that extra hand attack, that extra depletion. I think you might reach diminishing returns in a couple different ways by playing Tourach in those shells. But then, what about good old rock? What about good old-fashioned rock? Now we're getting really interesting because a few different things actually work a little bit more in Tourach's favor here. So number one, Rock is mostly playing Lurrus of the Dream Den, although there have been a couple boomer lists that 5-0'd recently. Godspeed to them. That's great, right? But Lurrus of the Dream Den, of course, can buy back Tourach, and notably, you can kick it. And that's pretty cool. Just something good to know. Not that that will be all that relevant all of the time, but it is a potentially powerful option. The other point here is that Tourach, of course, is very, very fragile. A 2-drop with toughness 1, right? We all know how that goes in a Renin 6 Lava Dart Plague Engineer world. Of course, being able to buy it back with Lurrus of the Dream Den, relatively free, not really disrupting what Rock already wants to do, that's definitely an upside. Here's another upside. Rock is actually that much less able to play more discard spells or more discard effects than anything we just talked about. Again, the red-black mid-range decks, they have Kroxa, right? They have Kroxa, who's not just dead if the opponent's hellbent. Kroxa's going to deal 3 to them and then escape next turn and end the game. So if you're playing the extra discard effects in the form of Kroxa, you're not really running the risk of bad top decks so much. And then on top of that, we have the aforementioned filtering in the red decks with Seasoned Pyromancer out of Jund and Spyro and Magmatic Channeler out of Rakdos. Rock does not have those luxuries. Rock cannot afford to play too many discard effects, otherwise your top decks are going to be too bad. But Tourach, again, he's modal. If all he is a bear, well, at least he's not dead, right? And at least he's pro-white, and at least he has a really, really high ceiling, and at least he's potentially recursive with Lurrus. In that sense, he is kind of like our Kroxa. They do very, very different things. I'm not saying the power levels or the effects are really at all similar, but you understand the role and the structure of the deck. That is where they're similar. The final way in which Tourach could be a better fit in Rock than in black-red mid-range decks is that Rock is absolutely, as always, overflowing with mana sinks. We have utility lands, Hexdrinker, Scavenging Ooze, the list goes on, so Tourach's modality is even more beneficial there. If it behooves you to maybe, you have 4 mana on turn 4, your Hexdrinker's got a level, maybe you put Hexy to level 3, to protect it from certain things, and then you play a Tourach to protect it from an Edict effect. It's not a fantastic use case for Tourach itself, but it does give you all kinds of flexibility, and Rock is where that flexibility, due to the dependence on mana sinks, shines the most. The other thing that I'll say, just to round out the discussion of where Tourach fits best, is in Dead Guy Ale or maybe Abzan Stoneblade, because whenever you can, in these Sword of Fire and Ice decks, in the Sword of Feast and Famine decks, even in the Shadow Spear decks, if all else being equal, if your depletion or your interaction can be on 2 legs, or 4 legs, or 10 legs, whatever it's going to be, if your depletion is on a stick that can turn sideways, then you will get a little bit, at least, of additional upside. It's just another potential equip target, and that is no small thing in decks that live and die in many ways based on the ability to connect with a weapon. So there you go, my friends. Those are my thoughts on Tourach Dread Cantor. I think the art is okay, despite all the jokes about it. I think it's interesting, it's bold. art direction. There are some cool callbacks. We've got the eyes on the cloak. We've got the wolf howling in the background. We know what that's about, right? And I love the old border treatment, obviously. I think this card can rock. I think this card can maybe see a little bit of play in like a traditional Dead Guy Ale deck too. I don't think it should coexist with Grief in an Ephemerate build, though. I think it's kind of one or the other, similar to how I don't necessarily see it as fully optimized when coexisting with Kroxa. But we've got kind of a him in Modern, and we've got a really interesting, unique take on it. We've got a modal spell, basically. We've got a threat that scales. It's protection from white, and at some point, you will be hemming your opponent out. You will be forcing them to discard 2 cards at random, which is absolutely wild and crazy. If you've never done it before, you owe it to yourself to play some Tourach Dread Cantor, even if it's just for fun. So as always, my friends, with a card like this, with so many moving pieces, so much to think about, I want your thoughts. You let me know. You let me know what you want to do with this guy. If you want to play him, if you want to throw him in the dustbin before he's even legal, let me know in the comments below. Stay tuned for more spoilers, and I will talk to you soon.